Hello, everyone, and welcome to this evening's lecture as part of the Courtaulds Research Forum. My name is Matthew Holman. I'm with the Centre for American Art at the Courtauld. And I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Jonathan Dentler for today's lecture. Just a brief note, if you do you have any questions over the course of Jonathan's lecture, please do put them in the chat. I'll be looking at it over the course of the paper. Jonathan will speak for around 50 minutes or so, and then there'll be time for questions at the end. So I'll introduce Jonathan now. Dr. Jonathan Dentler is the Postdoctoral Research Fellow at the University of Paris, Nanterre. His paper today is called Modern Enchantments, Anachronistic Space. The American Office of War Information oversees Radiophoto section in Central Africa and the British Raj between 1942 and 1945. So Jonathan is currently a postdoctoral research fellow with the Visual AI and Early Conflict Photography project, which aims to harness AI-reliant tools to analyze a large corpus of colonial, imperial, and international conflict photography. The project is connected with a network of archives in France and Britain. He received his PhD in history from the University of Southern California, where he also earned a visual studies graduate certificate. His dissertation, Wired Images, Visual Telecommunications, News Agencies, and the Invention of the World Picture, 1917 to 1955, is a global history of wire photography services. So I'll pass over to, hand over now to Jonathan, and very much looking forward to this, and I'll look forward to sharing the conversation in around 50 minutes. Thanks, Jonathan.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I'm happy to be here virtually and to share my talk. I hope that there'll be some good conversation afterwards. In this talk, I want to consider the work of the American Office of War Information's Overseas Radiophoto section during World War II, and particularly its efforts to establish radiophoto communication links with French Equatorial Africa and the British Raj. Two central lines of thinking motivate this inquiry. First, if it is true, as the feminist scholar Anne McClintock has argued, that the notion of anachronistic space was essential for ideological justifications of colonial dispossession, then how might the extension of nearly instantaneous picture telecommunications to the colonial periphery have challenged, complicated, or reworked such spatial and temporal schemas? The second concern has to do with deeply ingrained ideas about technology, science, and magic, which similarly subtended colonial notions of anachronistic space. As a number of scholars have argued, technology served as a key marker of anachronistic space, often working as a racialized measure of progress and civilization. According to such ideas, the development of materialist rationality in Europe produced knowledge of natural laws of cause and effect that crystallized into technical achievements. To this way of thinking, European science had progressively overcome magic, which was characterized by the customary, irrational, or arbitrary attribution of causal relations. In his series of articles on the genealogy of the fetish concept, William Peets showed that European notions of African difference hinged on the idea that Africans misperceived technology's real causal underpinnings, attributing magical causality to technical devices. Yet at the same time, an association with magic clung to modern visual culture in general, and to highly technical arenas of visual culture in particular, such as the cinema and, as we will see, radio photography. I am particularly interested in radio photography because, as a kind of modern enchantment, it had the potential to trouble such schemas, dialectically reversing the colonial spatial order of rationality and magic. Before returning to these issues, though, I'm going to briefly introduce what wire photography was. Oh, I'd better share my screen here. Following the advent of telegraphy, if photography was always bound up with circulation and tied to electricity and telegraphy in the popular imaginary, wire photography's large-scale adoption by the press, beginning in the 1920s, represented the first time that publics across the globe actually beheld images that had circulated as electrical information rather than as material objects. Following the advent of telegraphy in the 19th century, the duration involved in communication ceased to be primarily a function of geographic distance. Yet while telegraph cables carried numerical and textual information, images remained stubbornly tied to their material supports. The development of the photovoltaic cell around the turn of the century allowed inventors to build picture telegraphy devices that could scan a picture using light instead of a mechanical stylus on chemically treated paper. The German inventor Arthur Korn produced such a device, and it was even used to transmit some pictures to weekly illustrated magazines such as L'Illustration. Korn's device used a light to scan a picture attached to a rotating drum. A photovoltaic cell registered the reflected light and transmitted a current into a telegraph wire, which carried it to a receiver that would convert the signal back into light, exposing a negative attached to a synchronized rotating drum. The device could reliably transmit over considerable distances, but it was experimental and not suitable for mass production. It was only in the years following the First World War that the infrastructural and organizational conditions necessary to make national and international wire photography a reality came into place. As photo agencies developed geographically far-flung operations and the organizational capacities necessary to produce and distribute topical photography to newspapers quickly, a market for picture telecommunications began to take shape. From that point on, the wired image started to bridge the gap that telegraphy had opened up between the textual and the visual. A new class of images emerged whose visual qualities were measured, abstracted, transmitted, and reconstituted by telecommunications. Wire photography launched a cultural shift in which, for the first time, pictures were in the process of being dematerialized as information. This shift transformed not only the news, but also the everyday experience of time and space, and had far-reaching social and political implications. To people all over the world, wire photography graphically concretized the connectedness facilitated by international wire and radio communications. Wire photographs were perhaps the most thoroughly engineered and abstracted pictures devised in human history up to that point, yet also had the seemingly magical ability to dematerialize in one place, only to appear in another. This development belongs to a long history of technical innovations related to photography that associate the medium with surprise, disbelief, and the wondrous. Both popular and professional discourse about wire photography often invoked magic to describe the medium and its effects. In his autobiography, Kent Cooper, the longtime general manager of the Associated Press, looked back proudly on, quote, that eerie thing we named wire photo. In a 1937 textbook entitled News Pictures, the journalist Jack Price reflected that, quote, today the occurrence and its photographic reproduction are almost coincident. The brief time lapse between a happening in any part of the world and the pictorial reporting of it throughout the world, is little less than miraculous. Before the invention and application of the technical magic that makes this possible, such pictures were transported by every courier distinguished for super speed, from the relays of horses and carrier pigeons to motorcycle and airplanes. Such technical magic made concrete the way in which modernization rapidly and repeatedly made the impossible possible and continually reshaped the space and pace of experience. In a sense, all images possess the magical quality of being at once there and not there, appearing as both material objects and spectral resemblances to something else. W.J.T. Mitchell has suggested that images can be thought of as wild signs that resist mastery by any non-pictorial or iconoclastic master discourse. Images' uncanny or animist quality, he argues, should always remind us of Levi-Strauss's insistence on the dialectical persistence of the savage mind at the center of modernity. Like other image reproduction technologies, wire photography displaced images from their material support, though it did so in a unique way. Wire photos were, in a sense, doubly magical. Like all images, they were both object and resemblance, but they were also a particular kind of image that was capable of jumping from object to object across vast distances, traveling by radio wave or wire. Like magic, wire photos could make something invisible appear, not only the distant things they represented, but also the infrastructural network that enabled their speedy travel. Decades later, Marshall McLuhan echoed this association between telecommunications and the primitive in understanding media. For McLuhan, electronic media augured a retribalization, in his words, of Western society. While a limited group of engineers understood precisely how wire photography worked, the vast majority who looked at these images did not. So this is basically the black boxing effect. Wire photography heightened the eerie sense in which, since the 19th century, photography had allowed the image to float free of its material supports. It allowed a new kind of image to dematerialize, only to reappear hundreds or thousands of miles away, virtually instantaneously. By the 1930s, radiophoto connections linked together a number of cities located in industrialized nations with large newspaper markets such as New York, London, Berlin, Tokyo, and Buenos Aires. However, only with great difficulty could this network reach beyond the places where visual telecommunications infrastructure and its attendant media such as halftone photo engraving and mass daily newspapers existed. In this sense, while wire photography seems to annihilate space and time between regions separated by large stretches of ocean, for areas outside the geography traced by this network, distance widened relative to that system's interior. As global historian Roland Wenzelhumer has argued, space is essentially relative. That is to say, it is always produced by relations between objects in a given system. Time and space cannot actually be annihilated. Instead, communications infrastructure creates new spatial relations, arranging and connecting places, people, and things in new constellations. Thus, wire photography's visually mediated space-time compression simultaneously produced an outside defined by its relative distance from new picture distribution networks. In doing so, it contributed to longstanding ideas about tropical difference, according to which technology served as a key marker of anachronistic space, measuring progress and civilization. This situation would change dramatically during World War II, when the OWI radiophoto section effectively became a wire photography service on an unprecedented global scale, establishing operations in places where news agencies such as the Associated Press had never distributed pictures, since there was no chance of recovering profits in highly limited newspaper markets, and where access was restricted by colonial governments anxious about news entering or leaving their territories. Set up on December 12, 1941, under the leadership of former AP picture editor George Joe Hummel, the radiophoto section operated under the OWI's overseas branch and worked closely with the Office of News and Features Picture Division, which became the world's largest overseas distributor of press pictures, including negatives, prints, radio photos, plastic printing plates, and whole picture exhibitions. Each day, pictures would be selected from the US Still Picture Pool, a group of news agencies such as the AP as well as Life magazine, government agencies, the military photography services, and the OWI's own photographic services, and distributed around the world in various formats by airplane and radio. The OWI's distribution system quickly took on global dimensions. As one early organizational directive stated, the overseas branch had to reach, quote, all the 2 billion people who inhabit this globe and whose lives cannot escape the consequences of this global war. Via its Communication Facilities Bureau and Outpost Bureau, the OWI would coordinate a constant flow of information and news between enemy, neutral, and allied countries. Already by late 1942, this information flow constituted the largest news agency structure in the world, supplying news to places that did not have the money for commercial syndicate subscriptions. The OWI drew much of its talent from news agencies, newspapers, magazines, advertising, and wire photography services. In connecting colonial societies through news photography to the temporal pace and rhythms of global telecommunication, the OWI also rewired cultural geographies in ways that the engineers themselves only dimly understood. Photo theorist Ariella Azoulay has argued that photography has produced a civil contract according to which individuals implicitly allow themselves to become images in order to allow visibility for grievances and claims to citizenship by others who are similarly governed by sovereign power, whether or not they have the legal status of citizenship. I want to suggest that wire photography's ability to breach space and make different areas of the globe simultaneous with one another had the potential to threaten the colonial ideology of anachronistic space, which worked to bar colonized populations from taking part in the civil space of photography.
Hi, Jonathan. Oh, right. Sorry, I was just about to interrupt. Was that a blank screen?
I know. Yeah, that was.
Yeah, cool.
Was just,
we were just wondering. Yeah, thank you so much. We were just wondering.
Yeah.
Thanks.
It's just sometimes I have a blank screen so that people just focus on the words instead of the picture.
No, it was a very effective technique. There was just a comment in the chat, so I was just wanted to ask. Thanks so much.
No worries. This photo print from the Radiophoto sections files puts these dynamics on display. It shows a group of African youths looking at an OWI photo display board in the window of a large building. While the photo is labeled somewhere in Africa, the historian Carolyn Angle McGuire has identified the photographer as Maurice Frink, an OWI photographer actually based in West Africa at the Gold Coast Outpost. She argues that he may not have understood the geographical or cultural differences between West and Central Africa, or that he wanted to communicate a sense of the exotic and the other to his audience located in the US. In any case, the display traveled through various African towns, so it is difficult to say precisely where the photograph was taken. The board shows scenes from various theaters of the war from around the world, including many of soldiers, equipment such as bombers and aircraft carriers, and portraits of leaders such as Franklin Roosevelt. The board's title reads, "The New Juju, Power plus Cooperation equals Victory." Juju is a catch-all term derived from the French joujou, a toy or plaything, and denotes a belief system associated with African animist religions involving the use of objects and spells ritually deployed for their magical efficacy. It is closely tied to the concept of the fetish, which, as William Peets has shown, emerged in the cross-cultural contact zone along the West African coast during the early modern period and was later developed by European intellectuals to figure a form of magical thinking associated with objects. Several of the youths point at the board, indicating interest in certain photographs or elements therein. The OWI's caption pasted to the verso reads, "Somewhere in Central Africa, June 14th, 1943. Clustered about OWI picture exhibit showing the new juju or witch doctor magic of the Allies, African natives look at photographs of United Nations activity in the war for freedom." It is difficult to determine to what degree this photograph was staged, but it is revealing regardless. Certainly, it represents an example of what the anthropologist Brian Larkin has referred to as the colonial sublime, or the way that colonial powers introduced infrastructure and media technologies to the colonies as a political spectacle in order to overwhelm the senses with the achievements of modern science and engineering. The caption may have been written with an element of irony and humor for the benefit of Europeans and Americans stationed in Africa who certainly knew better than to believe in magic. Perhaps the caption writer believed that it would speak to Africans on another register, one that translated a message about modern military might into language they supposed would culturally resonate with an African public. Certainly, the OWI repeatedly emphasized the importance of pictures and photo display boards as a way to bring news of the war to societies in which literacy was not widespread and newspaper reading was not a common experience. Yet, as I have shown, magic was often invoked with regard to wire and radio photography in North America and Europe as well. In fact, the display's magic might instead reside in the fact of news photography itself as a globe-spanning infrastructure, which here worked to produce a collective called the United Nations. While certainly producing meaning using icon-based visual communication, radio photos also spoke to something more than their content. They also rendered visible the infrastructural system knitting together places like Brazzaville and Bombay with wider networks that included not just the colonial metropole, but also places such as New York, Sydney, Algiers, Bern, Stockholm, and many more. The OWI Radiophoto program placed such locales into new geopolitical and infrastructural relations. Whether staged or not, these young Africans knew that they were an audience for these pictures because they actively posed or were encouraged to pose as such. Indeed, scholars such as Christro Giri have shown that West and Central Africans by this period had had a long experience of photography in various settings and were adept at using it for their own ends, and certainly did not see it as something magical, at least not in any straightforward way. The middle figure points to a portrait of an African-American soldier carrying ammunition in a photograph labeled South Pacific. The figure on the right points to a picture of a man who, according to the caption, is located in India. The OWI Radiophoto program and Overseas News Bureau sought to suture Africans to a global public via photography and telecommunications, both as images going out to the world and as spectators for photographs coming to Africa from the world. It is instructive here to compare the photo to a much earlier image from the 1880s, imagining future electronic picture communications between colony and metropole. In this illustration from Albert Robida's serialized science fiction novel, Le XXe siècle, a colonial administrator uses a combination telephone and television device to maintain a private domestic link to his family, while indigenous people labor in the tropical background. In contrast, the scene here is distinctly public, taking place among a group of spectators who gesture and communicate about what they are seeing, located in a storefront street scene. While the work on photography in West and Central Africa has made immense strides in recent decades, including notably newer research by scholars such as Aaron Haney and Jennifer Bajorek on African photographers, it seems that relatively little work has been done on Africans during the colonial period as spectators of photography produced abroad. It is also interesting to note that this picture depicting an African encounter with photographs from around the world was itself meant to travel to other publics abroad as part of the OWI's mission to publicize the war efforts of the United Nations. Along with other colonized people in many parts of the world at this time, OWI radio photography helped constitute them as a transnational public, part of the civil space of photography. Crucially, however, this public always remained more potential than real. The Radiophoto section's efforts to propagandize Africans ultimately had only limited success, demonstrating the limits of the system I have just described, as well as the politics inherent in any infrastructurally produced cultural space. In Central Africa, actually constructing a radiophoto infrastructure was not an insurmountable problem. The more tenacious problems were the lack of photo engraving facilities and a mass newspaper audience, the difficulty of maintaining technology designed for the temperate North Atlantic and the humid tropics, and more decisively, colonial racism and racial hierarchies that militated against including Africans in a broad visual public sphere. In 1942, when the OWI Radiophoto connection was established between New York and Brazzaville, there were only 2 daily newspapers in the lower Congo Basin, both published in Leopoldville, on the other side of the river, modern-day Kinshasa, and no photo engraving facilities. The first OWI radiophoto engineer sent to Brazzaville reported to the New York headquarters that the area's European residents constituted the readership for these 2 newspapers, but there is good reason to doubt this judgment or to suspect that he did not appreciate the scope of African literacy in the area. By World War II, Brazzaville had developed into a sizable town with a permanent African population grouped in 2 neighborhoods, Bakongo on the west side of the city and Poto to the east. Considerable infrastructure investment during the interwar period and reforms that led to the end of concessionary company rule and what one historian of French Equatorial Africa called, quote, the economy of pillage, had led to improved social conditions. The population of Brazzaville at the time was recorded at around 40,000 permanent inhabitants. In the regional Kilari language, the area of the pool in the Congo River where Brazzaville and Leopoldville were located was known as Mavula, or the place to grow rich. From the African perspective, then, telecommunications installations and photo displays were undoubtedly seen in the longer context of local contacts with trading geographies and connections to the wider world. Between the more established Protestant and Catholic mission schools and secular primary schools established in Bakongo and Poto in the 1920s, literacy was no doubt on the rise, though still limited. Colonial administrators reported that peoples from the lower Congo who tended to live in the Bakongo neighborhood were making especially notable strides in the primary schools and taking lower clerical positions. Poto was a highly cosmopolitan neighborhood with people from all over West and Central Africa, including many Hausa and Senegalese who worked in the military and administration and were newspaper readers. Felix Eboué, who became the first African-descended French colonial governor in 1936 and subsequently became gouverneur general of the AEF, had a policy of promoting the development of an African elite known as évolué, who would make targets for propaganda and participated in the newspaper reading public. Le Courrier d'Afrique was a quasi-official newspaper with close ties to the administration and had a larger circulation, while L'Avenir Colonial Belge was, quote, more liberal with a flashier makeup, according to the OWI staff at the station. They each printed about 6 pages and included a weekly picture supplement. Lack of photo engraving facilities meant that the few OWI plastic picture plates that arrived by plane from New York were, according to a report from the OWI outpost staff, snatched up by the local press and eagerly printed. There is still a demand here for news pictures, hot stuff on the war in the Pacific, etc. The public wants to see pics of Americans in action, not posing at the end of an assembly line. I have telegraphed at least half a dozen times asking for hotter pictures and war maps. His report begged a larger question, namely, who constituted this public? Did it include Africans, or ought OWI material instead target the small population of Europeans that they believed constituted the primary readership of the daily newspapers? Who wanted to see hot news pictures? Responding to the lack of engraving facilities for printing radio photos in daily newspapers, the OWI capitalized on public spaces in towns and villages for display of visual news that did not rely on widespread literacy to be effective. The OWI used a Davidson offset reproduction machine, which could cheaply print radio photos on pamphlets and posters, which could either be put up in public places or included as pictorial supplements in the newspaper. The OWI staff regularly rotated and supplemented display boards with newer photos and posted radio photo posters at cafes, restaurants, and other public places. Far beyond Brazzaville and Leopoldville, OWI staff distributed these posters across the AEF and the Belgian Congo. In September 1942, the mayor of Libreville in Gabon informed the OWI's outpost chief in Leopoldville that the pamphlets and posters had, quote, immediately captured attention, especially of natives. By February 1943, the office was distributing their weekly sheet of radio photos around Brazzaville and Leopoldville in hotels, cafes, stores, the cross-Congo ferries, hospitals, the post office, and, quote, any place else with some bare space. One example from January 1943 shows images brought by radio photography and printed with a Davidson press of a speech by FDR before United Nations diplomats, a massive transport plane in Southern California, and a review of American troops by General Giraud in North Africa. The OWI mailed such sheets to the chef de département in the AEF, Cameroon, and the Belgian Congo with instructions to post them to their territories. Indeed, there is reason to think that such photos made it far beyond the larger towns to more remote trading outposts. In this photograph from the rubber market at Libongo, far to the north of Brazzaville, near the border with Cameroon, photographs of American military equipment and Franklin D. Roosevelt are affixed to the wall in a store selling textiles and basic consumer goods. However, two factors militated against success in the effort to create a broader visual public sphere, and both involve notions of colonial and anachronistic space. The first was the climate, which in ways both material and cultural made getting and disseminating radio photos difficult. As historian Nancy Stepan has argued, tropical nature was an imaginative construct as much as an empirical description of the natural world. Tropical, she argues, was more than a geographic concept, signifying, quote, a place of radical otherness to the temperate world with which it contrasted and which it helped constitute, in which the superabundance of nature was believed to overwhelm human endeavor and reduce the place to nature itself. Constant discussion of the climate's enervating effects by the OWI staff in their reports to New York may have served as a kind of cipher, underlining the ways in which this area was infrastructurally and politically outside wire photography's proper space and pace. With the onset of the rainy season in October, the staff's morale plummeted and work progressed at a snail's pace. Humidity caused their Davidson machines' rubber ink rollers to swell and smudge the posters. The humidity even caused cement to soften, apparently, producing vibrations in the transformer that rotated the sensitive light bulb inside the radiophoto receiver device, causing an intermittent short in one of the circuits. That April, the outpost chief, Jack Eames, reported, quote, the hottest, wettest, insectiest month yet. By 10 in the morning, he wrote, a muggy blanket of heat begins to settle down on us. It sits there, heavily and stickily, until about 5 in the afternoon. Speaking for myself, the worst effect of this period has been an unshakable languor, finding myself staring stupidly at a letter or report and unable to do anything about it. The radio photos that month, quote, reached an all-time nadir. Those received were mostly of poor quality and, quote, many of them have had no spot news value whatsoever. I could see no sense at all in displaying a cloudy, streaky photograph of a flying fortress when we can provide the same picture in a glossy print. Radio photos aren't much value in this territory anyway, and the only time they make an impression on the public is when they portray an event that has just taken place, such as the Casablanca conference. Based on the report, it seemed to Hummel in New York that, quote, our technical operations are wasting their fragrance on the jungle air. He proposed that the project had outlived its usefulness and was immobilizing a skilled radiophoto engineer with multiple bouts of malaria who could be better used in drier climates. It is as though the outpost chief wanted to draw a distinction between the tropics' unshakable languor and the speed called for in radio photography. The second factor had to do with the lack of proper technical and cultural infrastructure for radio photo dissemination. The OWI personnel clearly believed that radio photos required mass-produced daily newspapers to be really effective. The radio photo engineer informed New York that without a local photo engraving plant, quote, from a strictly radio photo point of view, I am wasting my time here. Samuel Eames, the head of the OWI Brazzaville Post, reported that while the radio photo poster sheets had been going over fairly well, They, quote, constitute little more than a novelty. People here are not accustomed to seeing pictures of events immediately after they happen, and their principal reaction to radiophoto is one of mild curiosity and a what will these Americans think up next attitude, which scarcely justifies the expense and labor involved in transmitting, receiving, and printing radiophotos. In Eam's mind, at least, radiophotography's success depended not just on good transmissions, but also on the ability to print transmitted images in newspapers en masse. Tom Sears, the chief of the picture division in New York, wrote back that he also had doubts and that, quote, as the pictures are only being used for display and for supplements, I feel our radiophoto operation could well be restricted. Finally, the OWI was never able to reconcile outreach to Africans with its cooperation with colonial administrations, and this contributed to the eventual scaling back of its Congo operation. Life in Central Africa, and particularly in the Belgian Congo, was more racially segregated and hierarchical than the generally liberal and New Deal-oriented OWI staff seemed to have been accustomed to or comfortable with. But they nevertheless acceded to the idea that indigenous peoples needed to progress before living under conditions of civil equality, reflecting how deeply the colonial imaginary of anachronistic space was ingrained. However, on the issue of addressing information activities at Africans, Eames reported to New York that, quote, the French are unanimously convinced that the native population is on the Allied side and that propaganda among them is a waste. I remain, as before, unconvinced on this point. His French sources may have deliberately obscured colonial political dynamics from him, for as the historian Eric Jennings has shown, the Free French in fact tried very hard to secure the consent and loyalty of Africans who had competing visions of the goals of the struggle against fascism and were crucial to the Free French cause after the defeat in 1940. The issue of race and diplomatic relations with the colonial administration emerged again around the OWI's film distribution in Congo movie theaters. One OWI documentary, Henry Brown Farmer, told the story of an African-American sharecropper in the South whose son was becoming a pilot in the armed forces. The documentary's message was that the older generation's sacrifices, together with New Deal and wartime policies, were opening up new opportunities for African Americans, and there would be a brighter future after the war. In the film's climactic sequence, the sharecropper's son shows his brother and sister how the plane flies before hopping in and taking off while his family watches on the runway. In September 1943, one Brazzaville OWI representative reported that they might have to withhold the documentary from distribution, quote, as the subject matter is quite delicate here. The Belgian Congo, at least, has fairly fixed policies as regards the natives, and in directing any propaganda to them, or in this case, in presenting the Negro question to Europeans here, we are needlessly placing the Bureau in an awkward position. I feel that we are being closely watched on this point in the Congo, and that we automatically create more goodwill between the two countries if we ignore the whole question. The French are slightly more lenient, but even there, I think it is best to duck the subject for essentially the same reasons. In these stills, we see another articulation of a visual public straining against the sun to see their son flying. This sight was denied to another potential public in the Congo, who might have been part of a transnational public sphere, but were excluded by the OWI's decision to court the European administration's goodwill. Yet another issue involves the non-circulation of photographs taken in the Congo by the OWI staff. OWI staff took several trips around the region in a truck to visit more remote towns and trading stations, checking on propaganda initiatives and taking photos for potential recirculation in the OWI's domestic and overseas news operations. However, instead of documenting social conditions that were often quite dire during the war, the OWI photographers tended to focus on strategic commodities like palm oil and rubber, showing the colony's contribution to the Allied war effort, a classic instance, it seems, of social relations between persons being transformed into material relations between persons and social relations between things. This photographic strategy was typical for wartime depictions of the colonies in American media. And as we see in possibly the most prominent example of photographic coverage of wartime Central Africa, an article in Life magazine illustrated by photographs taken by George Roger. The subject matter tends to focus on political and military leaders, like de Gaulle in the large photograph on the left, soldiers, and strategic commodities. Scenes of African labor are typically taken from a significant distance, making an exchange of gazes all but impossible. While the OWI generally followed this same pictorial strategy, there are some telling ambiguities. Bill Gifford, who operated the Davidson reproduction machine in Brazzaville, also took photos throughout the region. Jack Eames explained that as the Davidson machine was having trouble, he assigned Gifford to take photos, though he admitted, quote, "To tell you the truth, I am not quite certain to what extent we are expected to produce photographs of our area. There are not many opportunities for good spot news pictures down here, but feature material such as the enclosed can always be found." This picture of a monthly rubber market follows the pattern of focusing on strategic commodities, but it positions the camera just above and quite close to a crowd before the station where the rubber is being weighed and given a price. The caption approved by the American and French authorities reads, "General view of the weighing. The native at the scales in khaki coat and trousers is the major domo who weighs each bundle of rubber as it is handed to him and calls out the weight. The requisite payment is then handed out by the buyer, the seated man in white shirt and helmet, district manager for a commercial trading company. The other seated figure in brown shirt and helmet is the administrator of the territory, keeping a check on what is brought in." The caption does not dwell on the crowd itself or on the fact that the camera is close enough for a number of men in the crowd to gaze back quite directly. As remarkable a photograph as it might be, however, my research has been unable to find an example of it circulating in the American press, either as a radio photo or in another format. It seems that this example made its way back to New York by mail and came to rest in an archive where it remained until digitization made it available online. Perhaps these direct gazes, combined with the OWI's ambivalence about engaging Africans directly in photography's civil contract, contributed to its archival arrest. The episode points to some potential limitations, I think, to Azule's paradigm, which assumes that the sovereign power does not control photographic meaning and circulation, largely because of photography's tendency to become increasingly mobile and to recirculate. In the case of the OWI, multiple sovereign powers were involved in the production and circulation of photography, not only the United States, but also various colonial regimes with which the OWI had to negotiate. Moreover, the radiophotographic link by which they traveled was owned and operated by the state. Private media outlets such as Life also collaborated closely with the wartime state through institutions such as the US Still Picture Pool. After a tour of Central Africa in 1943, the executive director of the OWI's domestic branch concluded that if the agency was to accept rule by a tiny white minority, then, quote, "no propaganda founded on a basic message of democracy and freedom can be voiced in those two colonies." Well, he hoped that the post-war international cooperation would, quote, "include some supervisory mechanism whereby civilized nations which enjoy the right of ruling over primitive peoples would be held to standards of, quote, education and social and economic emancipation." He reasoned that the time is not yet ripe to stress this theme because the result of an American propaganda program directed at the natives would be to arouse and cause trouble among the more advanced few. The effect on the overwhelming majority would be absolutely nil. He called the radiophoto display boards rather overdone and recommended cutting the operation down to one staff member who would focus on cultivating personal ties with the European elite rather than mass information activities directed at a public sphere that included Africans. Very briefly, I want to outline the OWI's operations in India, which make for an interesting comparison with Central Africa. In India, the OWI Radiophoto effort met with more success, despite the fact that it confronted similar political difficulties navigating between the colonial administration and the colonized population. During the war, the OWI provided an astonishingly high proportion of international news photos printed in the Indian press. Radiophoto's decisive importance lay in how they implied a global network in which photos would be shared as quickly as the news they illustrated. By offering the possibility that Indians might become part of a global public, radiophotos also implied that the colony would no longer temporally lag behind the metropole. There is a large body of scholarship on American diplomatic engagement in India during World War II and how it contributed to the anti-colonial movement's eventual success. Recently, historian Deborah Cohn has argued that the American press played an important role in mobilizing American public opinion against British imperialism, galvanizing pressure on the Roosevelt administration to push the British to make concessions to nationalists. In considering photography in India during the colonial period, art historian Christopher Pinney has suggested that as it developed, photography alternately served the colonial state and anti-colonial resistance. While early photography was expensive and required elite knowledge to operate, its tendency to become cheaper and more mobile made it increasingly produce an anti-colonial public sphere. By the interwar period, when the anti-colonial struggle was reaching a height of mass participation and confrontation, the colonial government became extremely anxious about public photography, and specifically American press photo agencies. Radio photography charged this anxiety in new and important ways. By 1941, there were 4,000 newspapers and magazines in print in India in 17 languages. The press was split along two axes. First, between the English language papers and the vernacular press in languages such as Hindi, Marathi, Gujarati, and Bengali. The English press itself was divided between pro-Raj establishment papers such as the Statesman or the Times of India, and the anti-colonial nationalist press such as the Hindustan Times or Amrika Bazar Patrika. OWI statistics reveal that the vernacular press printed far fewer radio photos than did the English press, whether colonial or anti-colonial. Such papers tended to have lower circulations and less capital for investing in photo reproduction technology. Over the course of the war, however, the vernacular press increasingly used radio photos, particularly during momentous events. After early Japanese victories in early 1942, the US government worried that the political situation in India might be a strategic liability. They subsequently secured permission from the British government and the government of India to set up OWI operations there. In India, the OWI was split between six branch offices at Karachi, Bombay, Madras, Calcutta, Assam, and the headquarters in New Delhi. But while New Delhi was the political capital of the Raj, Bombay, present-day Mumbai, was the most important financial and telecommunications hub, since it was where ships and telegraph cables arrived from the Suez Canal and the Gulf of Aden to the west. The OWI therefore located its radio photo operation in Bombay, receiving photos at a radio station at Pali Hill. Posters and picture displays were a vital way of reaching a broader public sphere with radio photos. In India, the OWI distributed photos via United News posters, displayed in public places throughout India, such as railway stations, bus stations, coffee houses, religious gathering places, and shopping districts. A Bombay imam wrote to the OWI to say that his school, quote, situated in and run by one of the biggest mosques in the city, would welcome an opportunity to display war pictures published by you from time to time. Would you be so kind as to forward gratis the war pictures as they are published to the above address and enable the students, as also the hundreds of Muslims visiting the mosque for prayers, to keep abreast of the latest news in pictures? By November 1943, the OWI distributed over 7,000 posters weekly around India, increasing over the course of the war. While it is difficult to assess how many people exactly saw these posters, and particularly how far they were able to reach rural people, it is safe to say that they helped produce a much wider visual public sphere, beyond the colonial elite and the more limited newspaper reading middle class. For the first time, the OWI brought a large selection of radio photos of international events to the subcontinent targeted at Indian editors. A, quote, steady flow of editors visited the offices in Bombay to discuss their editorial needs, and the office regularly hosted parties and meetings for editors working for both the English and the vernacular press. The D-Day landings marked a turning point in the widespread use of radio photography in India, and the invasion pictures were a huge success for the OWI. As the only organization with radio photo reception in India, the OWI had a picture exclusive for about 2 weeks until airmail photos started to arrive. Radio photos were printed across both major divides of the Indian press, distributed around the subcontinent from Bombay by plane. The OWI report on the Indian vernacular press's reaction disclosed that, quote, the first few days of the invasion, it was not uncommon for 4 or 5 radio photos to be published in the Statesman, the Amrika Bazar Patrika, and the Hindustan Standard. Vernacular language papers, which do not ordinarily use photos, were eager to get them. A Hindi daily paper, which had not used pictures for the last 5 months, used our radio photos in spite of the fact that they have no processing facilities of their own. During the first 2 or 3 days, morning papers containing our radio photos were completely sold out by 9 a.m. Editors of important papers became OWI and picture conscious, calling us up at all hours to ask if any more pictures had been received, and often detaining their processing staffs when they learned that late radio photos were being delivered to them. The Hindustan Standard, for several days, kept a 2-column front page center space reserved for our radio photos. Great crowds could apparently be seen gathered around the public radio photo exhibits at any hour of the day. The nationalist press also used the OWI's D-Day radio photos as an opportunity to criticize the British administration as lagging behind the technical curve. The June 24th, 1944 issue of the popular Indian tabloid Blitz reported that, quote, the U.S. Office of War Information has been serving the Indian press with a super efficient and most helpful service of radio photos. Invasion photos were supplied to all Bombay papers on the night of D-Day and distributed by plane through India the next morning. The government of India's Bureau of Public Information made its own significant contribution by dispatching hot and steaming pictures of Kent, the Garden of England, the ancient Cathedral of Canterbury, and hops, the most important among the crops in Kent, among other thrilling subjects, end quote. Here, it was Britain that lagged behind in a kind of pastoral, anachronistic space, offering staid pictures of rural landscapes instead of thrilling combat radio photos. For the Indian public, radio photography visually concretized how political and cultural geography was shifting during the war, and as new telecommunications infrastructure and the way in which new telecommunications infrastructure connected India to the globe. The OWI adapted its propaganda to Indian editors' desires, particularly when it came to graphically illustrating India's growing links to the world. The OWI picture editor in Bombay, for example, recommended using radio photos to cover Indian officials' visits abroad and the return of American officials from India to the US, which were, quote, worthy of a radio photo, if only to point out graphically the speed of transportation between the two countries and its post-war implications. By late 1944 and 1945, newspapers such as the Times of India were running radio photos almost every day to cover the fast-moving events of the end of the war. In the nationalist press as well, radio photos became heavily used by 1945. In one example from the Bengali paper Jugantar Patrika, a heavy-handed retouching job on Joseph Stalin's mustache and jet black coiffure made sure their readers would not fail to recognize the Soviet leader at a glance. Radio photography could both undermine and reproduce colonial schemas of anachronistic space. Radio photos seemed to suture the colony to a globally simultaneous present, with images whose speedy flight from world historical events made thrilling news, no matter how poor the visual information they carried. Belonging to this spatio-temporal structure offered an experience that palpably refuted colonial notions of anachronistic space. Various factors made it difficult to extend this network beyond the industrialized world. Yet in Central Africa, the OWI staff tended to interpret the difficulty of providing radio photo service as proof of colonial backwardness, rather than as proof of colonial racism and power relations. Far from creating a global village, telecommunications media can exacerbate existing divides by making the places it does not connect even more distant in infrastructural and cultural terms. Anachronistic space can be produced by infrastructure as well as destabilized by it, something worth keeping in mind with regard to the contemporary digital divide. I want to close by looking at another image that seems to meditate on these dynamics. It is from the New York Herald Tribune's masthead, which in this edition from January 5th, 1933, was placed directly above a radio photo depicting the South American ocean liner Atlantique on fire in the English Channel. The image is both a spatialized vision of time and a temporalized vision of space. On the left, an old man contemplates the landscape of the past, the old world with its pyramids, classical Hellenic ruins, and camel caravan. On the right, a youth points toward the future and the new world, distinguished by a factory, modern agriculture, a locomotive, and a telegraph pole. Separating the two and presumably occupying our present is that decisive technology of time discipline, the clock, and the symbol of the US state, an eagle. Yet the image begs the question of just where in the world the two spaces might be at any given time, where these two times might meet and overlap, and whether the two figures might ever be able to turn and face one another. Thank you. I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was a really, really wonderful paper, and particularly compelling image to close on there, I think, to draw together your ideas about time and space. Please do comment, leave a comment or a question in the chat. And as you're thinking perhaps there, I just wanted to ask something which is a slight deviation from, in many ways, the broad thrust of your focus, which is on kind of colonial administrations. But obviously, you know, the OWI would fight propaganda war on two fronts broadly, right? It would be kind of looking towards its friends and looking towards its enemies. And the OWI is famous for its leaflet warfare, of dropping leaflets and bombarding particularly enemy territories and saying, surrender, you will drown, etc., whether that's in Tunisia or Corsica and so on. And I just wondered, what's the relationship in terms of the OWI strategy between kind of the leaflet warfare and the dissemination of dropping images and dropping text into particular places to fight a propaganda war, and wire photography? I don't know if that's something that you've been thinking.
Yeah, it'd be an interesting question to see if they printed any photos on leaflets for dropping. I didn't actually research the sort of like psychological warfare component, like what was aimed at enemies rather than what was aimed at allies or the domestic audience that much. But I wouldn't be surprised if maybe they used radio photos, because in some ways it's, you know, it's most effective for things that are happening right at the moment. I know on the other side, you know, for example, as soon as Mussolini is recaptured by the Germans, rescued from the imprisonment in the Apennines, they have to send out a photo of him, a wire photo, to say, like, we got him. So I wouldn't be surprised if maybe it was used in one of those examples, but I'm not sure of any particular example that I could draw on.
Okay.
Thinking about that.
Right.
And although another thing, was this the OWI that caught it? I know that another thing that they did, it was also possible to intercept radio photo signals.
Right.
And so there was intelligence gathering and propaganda monitoring, where the other.
Would that possibly have been sensitive material, or unlikely so?
Yeah.
Okay.
In the German archives, I found a letter from Heinrich Himmler's secretary talking about it was right before the invasion of Sicily, and it was a photo of a new amphibious landing vehicle that was being sent from New York to Moscow. Presumably telling the Soviets about this new technology or something. And so there was a discussion of needing to prepare for this new type of equipment. So yeah, there's an intelligence angle to it as well.
Really good, really interesting. Are there any questions on the chat for Jonathan? Just give it a moment. No one wants
to maybe question because I'm questioning it. Ariel Azoulay's sort of whole idea of the civil space of photography, and how this empirical example fits into it or doesn't. That's something that I'm really trying to wrestle with as I rewrite this. But what is this question?
So the question here from Richard Herbert is it technology or politics? And maybe the relationship between the two, is it technology or politics that prevents the British administration from matching the OWI and providing up-to-date information to its colonies?
I think it's a bit of both, because there was an effort to do it, and it apparently had major technical problems. But I think that it's probably more of a question of will. Although the fact that the administration certainly would have had control over that link sort of makes me wonder why there wasn't the political will, because they could have used it for their own kind of information ends. I mean, the Indian Communications Company was basically a sort of like subsidiary of Imperial Cables and Wireless, which was highly connected to the government. On the other hand, maybe there was a feeling that the Indian press would be able to form enough of a lobby to kind of use it, turn it to their own ends. Because Imperial Cable and Wireless did make a radio photo link from London to Australia in 1934, and sent photos back and forth. So it has to make you wonder why was it somehow possible to do it to Australia, but not to India? I think that politics probably did play a big role. And once they learned that the OWI was going to make a radio photo link, they restarted their effort. Although ultimately they didn't have much success. So technical and political, but probably more political.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you so much. And another question here: have you run into Germaine Krull, who ran the Free French Photo Service in Brazzaville in those years, and her photos were published in the press, but not sure if they were transmitted through radio photography?
Yeah, that's a good point. I had come across her and learned that she was working for the Free French Photo Service down in Brazzaville. And I need to check on that again. But I think when I learned that, I did a little looking around to see if I could find any radio photo stuff by her, and I couldn't. But I think I need to look at that again, just to have more of an awareness of how the Free French photo production, of what that photo production was like and how it circulated. So thanks for reminding me about that, Kim Sichel. Okay, awesome.
Thanks, Kim.
Thank you for that.
Are there any other final questions for Jonathan? We've probably got enough time for another question. One sort of query I had about methodology. I mean, so there's some really extraordinary archival material that you've clearly uncovered, and I just sort of wanted to ask about how you worked through those different archives. So you're saying you were working archives in Germany, in France, in the States. What was your experience as you were kind of traversing those archives, and what were you kind of looking for? Because there's some extraordinary moments in there when you were saying like that really wonderful close up of the crowd scene of those men looking back at us. It was a really compelling image. And then there was this wonderful close reading at the end of the New York Herald Tribune masthead. And I just wonder, what are you privileging or what are you looking for as you move through these international archives? And what then do you kind of look back to research and sort of to think, okay, well, that wasn't shown or that wasn't reproduced back in the States, and why? Could you maybe just say a few words about the methodology there?
Yeah. I guess they all come from very different phases and have different ways of coming together. Like the really deep archival stuff was very methodical, and it was just going through a lot of finding aids and looking for radiophoto or any kind of thing, any kind of term like radiophoto, because a lot of these archives had not been worked over, and there was not a good there's a little here and there, but was not a good book on radio photography. So I just had to be very methodical and go to lots of different archives. But then the the other one, the masthead, that came from the Folkerding Center, this Center for Creative Photography in Tucson at the University of Arizona. It's a great photo archive, and it has the archive of one of the engineers who made one of the early sort of wire photography systems. And I was coming across that, and I think it was just as an example of one of the photos that his system had transmitted. But I just glanced at the masthead, and I was like, oh yeah, that's like
such a big
they're
story.
it's just telegraphing this whole idea of anachronistic space. So that one happened that just kind of happened in a flash of recognition. But then the other photo, actually, it came later because I realized I'd been so methodical about researching radio photography in these archives that I'd sort of forgotten to look in a wider sense at the photo reproduction. So that came much later, when I was just like, well, I need to look on the website of the Library of Congress and see what were all the photos that were produced in or about Central Africa by the OWI, whether or not they were radio photos. Like that photo, like they say, it was feature material. There was no big event in it that meant that it had to be a radio photo.
Sure. Yeah.
So that came later, I guess, in a kind of like covering my bases and broadening my perspective.
And thinking back on the reception. Yeah, wonderful. So final question from Michelle Smiley. Would you like to expand upon how you see your case studies fitting or not with Azule's civil space of photography?
Yeah, well, so I mean, like I said, I don't know. Reading that book, I was a little like, well, I don't know if the state's not that important. I mean, in this case, it's very important, and it's like although these people are working for the state. So, I think that a lot of the particular examples that are used in Azule's book are ones that are either produced by journalists working with some kind of like code of ethics, or by like people we would recognize as citizen journalists or something like that, if we think about social media or that kind of a thing. And so in that sense, maybe it's a little bit presentist or something, or at the very least, of course, there's the parts of the book that go back all the way to the beginning of the invention of photography. And overall, I find the scheme pretty compelling, but this is certainly an example where the state's involvement was pretty important. But I guess the schema is capacious enough that it can also be like, well, even if the state controlled it or it sat in an archive for 80 years, now it's being recirculated. Like I just showed it to you, which shows that it can have like a rebirth or a later recirculation that is outside of that state control. I don't know, but it's yeah. something that I'm thinking about.
Great, thanks,
David.
Jonathan. And maybe we'll close then with David Peters Corbett's question. How did you find and settle on the topic of radio photography? Did the visual aspect specifically attract you as someone working in a history department?
Yeah.
Short answer.
I like that. Well, they're cool because there's a lot of images I didn't show. I didn't have time, but some of them can be quite painterly, which I like, even though they're kind of crappy images, which I feel like may not get the attention that maybe they deserve from a lot of art historians, because they're not what you would see in a museum or something like that. And so I do love the visual world, and I was ready and willing to go to a lot of archives and do that work. And so I thought, I'm the person for this job.
Fantastic. And we're really grateful that you were. Thanks so much for your talk today, Jonathan.
Thank you.
And yeah, congratulations again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.